By first light, Brett Graham already had steel in his hands. The maul head rang once against frozen tamarack, and the sound went clean through the cedar trees, sharper than a rifle crack in that cold. He split in steady sets of 12, breathing through his nose, counting without looking like he had on jump runs when the wind was wrong, and counting was the only thing between order and panic. The rounds stood stacked under the eaves by the back door, bark silvered with frost. When he was done, he carried 2 galvanized buckets down to the creek, boots finding the old roots in the dark by memory, and filled them where the current still moved black under skim ice. He was 64 now, retired from the Forest Service long enough that his knees forecast weather better than any radio. 32 seasons as a smoke jumper had left him with a left shoulder that clicked in wet cold and a habit of checking exits in every room, even his own. He lived alone in a cedar log cabin above Idaho's Lochsa drainage, where winter could drop 6 feet overnight in the shaded draws, and the nearest year-round neighbor sat 21 miles of washboard road away, if the road stayed open at all. Some weeks in January it didn't. Then he was an island with a chainsaw, canned beans, and what he'd split before the storms. 3 years earlier, his wife Lena had gone down in the feed store parking lot with a hand on a bag of chicken scratch and never stood up again. Aneurysm, the county doctor had said, like naming the lightning after the strike. Quick, he added, because people always added that like Mercy had anything to do with it. Brett had driven home with her coat still on the passenger seat and spent that first night sitting at the kitchen table until dawn, afraid to look at the hallway where her boots usually waited. After that, hope stopped being useful. Routine did not. Split wood before first light, water from the creek, mend fence where elk had folded it flat, crossing to lower brows. Check the old trapline cameras for cat sign and trespassers. Sweep stove ash. Log weather by hand in the same green notebook Lena used to write grocery lists and reminders about things they never forgot anyway. Milk, yeast, coffee, sharpened chains. The pages in the front still carried her quick slanted script. The back half held his block letters. Wind from WSW. Barometer falling 2 inches overnight. Raven absent from West Snag. He trusted notes more than memory. By September, Fish and Game called like they did every other year. Wolfpack movement study, seasonal contract, same stretch of drainages between state land and private timber leases. They had younger techs with tablets and drone plans and bright synthetic jackets, but they still hired Brett for the hard placements. Benches above creek narrows, game trails that braided in deadfall, edges where scent drift mattered. He was patient, quiet, precise with bearings, batteries, scent control. He could hike 10 miles without speaking a word and come back with every camera hung at the right height, angled north to avoid washout, metadata in order. He took the contract because it paid diesel and feed and because it gave his waiting a name. He had no appetite for town talk. The women at the Grange still tilted casseroles toward him every Christmas like food might patch the absence, and men at the feed store clapped his shoulder too hard and asked if he was keeping busy. Busy was for people dodging thought. Brett preferred useful. Out on the slope above the Lochsa where larch went gold against black fir and the river moved like cold glass in the canyon, useful meant noticing. A bent willow where there had been none yesterday. One less raven at the gut pile. Coyote yips that should have started at dusk, and didn't. He could sit on a stump an hour without moving, watching shadows slide across opposite timber, and tell you exactly when a place shifted from day habits to night habits. That, more than anything, felt like living still. Not comfort, attention. The first 11 days of the survey gave him nothing but proper work. Camera cards full of grey wolves moving in family order. Led female, yearlings, The broad-chested male with the torn right ear. Mule deer slipping by at first light, white tails twitching. A black bear too thin for September, ribs showing. Once, a young cow elk with wire around one hind leg, probably from an old fence somewhere upridge. He logged all of it. Date, time, temp, moon phase if visible. Changed lithium packs before they dipped. Wore nitrile gloves when he handled housings, then dusted mounting straps with dry duff so they didn't stink of human oils. On the 12th evening, rain came thin and constant, tapping the cabin roof in patient fingers. Brett ate reheated venison stew from a chipped blue bowl, washed it, then sat under the yellow cone of the kitchen lamp with a stack of SD cards and his old laptop. He copied files to 2 drives, one working, one backup, because digital things lied when you trusted them. The stove clicked as it cooled. Wind rubbed fir boughs against the eaves. He moved through images by folder. Cam 03, Cam 04, Cam 07. At 1941, a grey male entered frame from the left, head low, tail neutral. Good condition, mud on lower forelegs. Brett typed a note without looking at the keyboard. At 1941, 07, the wolf stopped. Ears flattened hard to the skull. Mouth closed. Weight shifted backward. At 1941-08, the wolf stepped back one full pace, then another. Not bolting, not posturing, just yielding ground. Something crossed the far right edge of frame. Brett leaned in until his breath fogged the screen. He scrubbed back frame by frame. Most of it was blur and dusk grain, but the shape was wrong in ways his body recognized before his mind did. Upright. Two-legged. No swing of forelimbs the way a bear walks when it rises to scent. Shoulder height, relative to brush markers. Near an elk cow. No headlamp flare, no reflective tape, no clean human outline. Gone in less than 2 seconds. He sat very still and listened to the cabin. Stove tick, rain, his own pulse in his ears. Glitch, he said out loud, voice rough from disuse. Compression artifact. He reopened the raw file. Same result. He checked timestamp integrity against camera internal log, then against his deployment notes. Camera angle, 12 degrees downslope, north-northeast. Trigger delay, 1 second. Burst mode, 3 shots plus 10-second clip. All standard. He moved to Cam 08, located 2 ridges down along the same drainage line. 3 nights later, at 1938, a set of mule deer froze facing upslope. One stamped, then held. At the edge of frame, same vertical transit in the brush line. Dusk dark, moving with a stride spacing no bear could manage on that grade. Cam 09, 4 nights after that. Wolves this time again. The tawny male and 2 juveniles. Tawny looked upwind, hackles half raised but not in attack posture. Then all 3 drifted off trail and stood aside. The figure passed behind Alder, visible in slats. Long step, pause, long step. Deliberate, no rush, no charge. Gone before full dark. Brett pushed back from the table and stood. His chair legs scraped the plank floor loud as a shout. He crossed to the sink, filled a glass with cold creek water, drank it, set it down, then returned and replayed every clip once more. Outside, rain became sleet. He knew what men in offices did with impossible footage. If they trusted you, they mocked it to your face and laughed later. If they didn't, they still used it. Grant decks, media teasers, some biologist's side hustle lecture under the banner of anomalous wildlife behavior. Coordinates leaked. Curiosity drove boots into places that only stayed alive because they were ignored. If the clips got out, every hobby tracker with a thermal scope would be in that drainage by week's end. He also knew what happened when people got scared in timber. They trapped first and sorted facts afterward. Brett copied the 3 sequences into a folder labeled Calibration Check and stripped preview thumbnails. Then he opened the paper topo map taped to the wall beside the pantry, the one with grease pencil circles from 10 years of surveys. He drew a red line through Cam 07, Cam 08, Cam 09, and extended it along 2 benches that held late light and steady wind. Transit corridor, dusk only. Always upwind of wolves. Not random. At dawn he packed 4 extra cameras, 2 spare lockboxes, lithium cells warmed overnight by the stove, and scent-free wipes. He checked forecast, hard freeze coming, then hiked out under a sky the colour of unpainted steel. No call to the regional office, no note to the seasonal coordinator, just boots, map, quiet. He placed the first new camera above a game trail pinch point where rockfall forced movement into a narrow seam between fir and chokecherry. The second he mounted low across from a seep where hoofprints layered in mud. Third and fourth he staggered along the red line at intervals that would catch stride and direction, but not obvious landmarks. He took bearings twice at each site, then once again before leaving, because being wrong by 40 yards out here could turn mystery into noise. He moved his evening chores earlier after that. Wood split by noon, fence mending in late afternoon, supper at 5. By 6:30, he was on a ridge stump above the drainage with a wool cap pulled low and binoculars in his lap, watching day fold inward. The waiting changed as soon as he admitted what he was waiting for. With wolves, you looked for rhythm, where they crossed, where they avoided, how weather shifted their line. This was different. The tall transit had rhythm too, but there was choice inside it. Caution, yes. Also intention. It threaded benches where sight lines were broken and wind carried downhill toward open water. It never stepped into clear meadow light. It never approached a bait smell. It never ran from wolf presence unless approached too closely. Twice in 6 days, camera clips showed wolves rerouting without panic, tails low, neither pursuing nor bolting. Once, a mule deer doe held her ground and merely turned her head as the figure passed behind alder 20 yards upslope. Whatever it wasn't moving like an apex hunter on a take. By the 3rd week of September, Fish and Game emailed asking for preliminary pull dates. Ranchers in the adjacent valley had reported unusual calf losses, and pressure was building to redirect staff and gear south. Brett read the message at his table, cursor blinking over the reply box, and felt the old occupational fork in the road. Follow procedure or follow terrain truth. If he pulled cameras now, he'd lose the line before pattern resolved. If he submitted those clips, he'd lose control of everything else. He replied with numbers only, wolf pass counts, denning movement shifts, battery status, and requested 2 extra weeks to complete statistically useful transit continuity. Dry language, no adjectives. He'd learned long ago that the more remarkable something sounded, the less anyone believed it. But the stakes kept widening, even in silence. If he was wrong, if low light and motion blur had fooled a tired old man with too much empty house behind him, he'd be chasing ghosts while real management decisions got made without good data. The drainage could lose seasonal protections. Wolves could get pushed into conflict lines and shot under depredation permits. Ranchers already wound tight from calf losses would see every shadow as cause. If he was right, and this was a rare, intelligent animal, using the corridor on a clock as exact as any migration, exposure could kill it faster than winter. Not by starvation, by attention. Traps. Men who needed proof more than they needed restraint. And beneath all that sat something he didn't say out loud. For the first time since Lena died, Dusk no longer felt like a sentence. It felt occupied. Not with company exactly, but with exchange, the kind made of held distance and mutual wariness. He found himself speaking softly while he checked wind at the ridge, habit from years briefing jump crews before drop. Winds quartering west, creek noise high tonight. You've got my scent unless you're above me. Once he caught himself adding, Lena would have laughed at this map and stopped with his throat tight, hand on cold binocular glass. He did not believe in signs. He believed in track depth, bark shear, hair caught on snag bark, timestamps that held under audit. Still, when he hiked the transit line after a night frost and found broad midfoot impressions in damp loam where no boot tread registered heel to toe, he stood over them a long time before taking photos. The prints were too long for his own size 12 and too narrow for Bear, weight distributed through the center with a toe splay that looked almost hand-like in the mud. Nearby, young aspen showed vertical bark pulls higher than he could reach without raising an arm. He photographed, measured, covered the prints with a fallen branch so sun wouldn't bake them before he could return. At the cabin that night, he opened his green notebook to a fresh page and wrote, in block letters steadier than he felt, "Continue Dusk transit. Bipedal, non-aggressive behavior around wolves. Do not disclose cords." Then he underlined it twice. Outside, the creek talked in the dark. Fir tops moved against a moon not yet full. Brett sat with the lamp off, letting his eyes adjust to window reflection, and understood exactly what could be lost from one careless phone call. A study, a corridor, a living thing that had learned this country's oldest rule better than most men ever did. Be seen only when you choose it. He closed the notebook, set tomorrow's batteries by the stove to warm, and laid the red pencil across the map where the line climbed into timber. Tomorrow, he would add one more camera and move 40 yards higher to catch the ridge approach. Tomorrow, he would keep watching. For now, that was the only promise he could make and mean. He was out before dawn again, headlamp off, moving by the grey that came before actual light. Frost had skinned the puddles in the yard. He shouldered a pack with one camera, one lockbox, a length of chain, and the bolt cutters he carried mostly for old wire he found in drawers. At the map nailed by the pantry, he touched the red line once with a knuckle, then stepped into timber. The climb above Cam 09 was steeper than it looked on contour. Loose shale under needle duff made each step a choice. He moved slow, saving his knees, testing handholds on roots. When he reached the bench, he wanted 40 yards higher, just off a narrow run between two wind-thrown firs. He stood still long enough to let the woods settle around him. Raven, east. Squirrel chatter, close. Creek noise below, steady, masking minor movement. He found a subalpine fir with a clean trunk and mounted the new unit chest high, angled downslope into shadow where evening would hold shape a little longer. He wiped the housing, brushed bark dust over the strap, took his bearing, then took it again, wrote coordinates in the green notebook, then copied them to the agency sheet with one decimal less precision out of habit he did not examine too closely. By the time he looped down and checked Cam 07 and Cam 08, the sun had lifted just enough to turn frost white along dead grass edges. Cam 08 had burned battery faster than it should have. Cold and too many triggers from swaying brush. He trimmed a branch with his folding saw, changed packs, and tucked the spent cells inside his coat to keep them from hard dying before he could test salvage at home. At Cam 09, he found tracks crossing the game trail in the damp strip beside a seep. 2 wolves, one juvenile by size, and there, offset upslope by 6 feet, one long impression in mud where weight had sunk and lifted clean through the midfoot. No heel punch like a boot, no claw register like bear. He crouched, breath steaming, and set his tape beside it. 15¼ inches by just over 5 at the widest point. Depth shallow for size, even load. He photographed from 3 angles, then stood and looked into the trees without turning his head much, the way you did when you didn't want to announce where your eyes were pointed. "Morning," he said quietly, and hated himself a little for it. No answer except wind running high branches. By the end of that week, the pattern tightened instead of fraying. Camera clips came in with the same narrow window. 1930-something to 1940-something, light gone flat, color draining. The figure moved ridge parallel along benches above water, usually upwind of wolves, occasionally crossing behind deer that watched and then resumed feeding. No charge behavior from anything in frame. No panic scatter. Once, the tawny male wolf stood broadside with head low, ears half back, while the tall blur paused behind alder at 30 yards and then altered line to pass farther uphill. Deliberate separation. Brett watched each sequence at full speed, then frame by frame, then again after a night's sleep. He marked stride spacing on still captures using known sapling distance. He wrote down branch heights for rough scale. He added weather notations because wet air changed how edges rendered. Every test he knew to call it artifact came back and failed to explain consistency. The office didn't care about artifacts. It cared about deadlines. A voicemail came in Monday noon while he was splicing fence wire where elk had folded a panel flat. Field coordinator from Lewiston, voice clipped and polite. "Brett, we need projected pull schedule by Thursday. South Valley depredation issue escalating. Command wants assets flexible. Call me back." He finished the splice before calling. Not from the cabin line, from his old handheld at the ridge where reception blinked in and out. "Projected pull in 12 days, he said when she answered. "Need continuity through moon phase for movement model." Pause. Keyboard clicking on her end. 12 is long for what we're hearing down here. What you're hearing and what's happening aren't always the same thing. Another pause, longer this time. "You seeing anything that affects human safety?" Brett looked down into the drainage where fog still sat in creek bottoms, like breath held in cupped hands. "Seeing wolves using benches exactly as prior years," he said. "Data's clean. Pull early and you'll get holes big enough to drive an argument through." She exhaled through her nose, not quite a laugh. "You always did know how to make it about statistics. Because stats are what keep people from making it about stories." When he clicked off, his shoulder ached where old injury lit up in cold. He stood there until the signal bars dropped to none. Hard weather came 3 nights later, fast and mean. Temperature plunged at sundown. By midnight, a dry wind had stripped leaves and snapped dead tops, somewhere across the draw with rifle-shot cracks. In the morning, he found Cam 10, hanging by one twisted strap. Lockbox door peeled where a falling snag had glanced the trunk and sheared the mount. Housing busted. Card gone, likely flung downslope into slash too thick to grid before snow. He stared at the damage longer than necessary, jaw working once. Lost data bothered him out of proportion, not because of paperwork, because each gap gave doubt a place to breed. He salvaged what he could, hiked the busted metal back out, and replaced the unit from his personal stash, an older camera with slower trigger and a cracked latch he had taped. By the time he was done, light had gone thin and his knees were arguing with every downhill step. At the creek crossing below Saddle Spur, rain 2 days later swelled water over the log he usually used. He tested it with one boot and felt the whole thing shift under current. Not today. He backed out, rerouted a mile upstream, found the old cable footbridge on State Parcel half collapsed, and spent an hour lashing one side with paracord and fence staples from his kit just to get across safely. Coming back in dusk sleet, he slipped on iced rock and soaked one leg to the thigh. He dried socks at the stove that night and wrote in the notebook with fingers that wouldn't quite uncurl. The delay cost him 2 days on the upper loop. When he finally reached the north cameras again, 2 units had gone into low power mode from cold, and one had filled its card with wind-triggered grass. Useless blur after useless blur. He sat on a stump and laughed once with no humor in it, then set to work. Lower sensitivity, clear trigger zone, fresh lithium, angle shift to avoid backlit stems. Routine, corrective action, keep moving. But pressure from down valley kept climbing. Ranch photos circulated, dead calves in muddy lots, men standing over them with hats off and faces set. By Friday, Fish and Game sent a formal note. Given depredation response requirements, all non-critical camera assets may be recalled immediately. May, not must, but the word was there like a hand on his back. Brett read it, folded it, slid it under the coffee tin, and drove into the adjacent valley himself the next morning, because speculation was easier to kill with boots than with email. The place smelled of wet hay and diesel. He parked by a gate where 2 ranch dogs barked until the owner recognized him and waved him through. Men were tired, angry, and ready for any explanation that pointed away from their own fences and routines. "You're the wolf guy," one said, jerking his chin at Brett's pack. "Tell your office to trap whatever's doing this." "Show me the carcasses first," Brett said. They walked him to 3 sites over 6 miles. At the first, the calf had been dragged 30 yards into willow and cached with leaf litter and dirt. Cougar sign obvious once you looked. Punctures at neck, drag marks in pairs, scrape patterns. At the second, scavengers had opened what predation started. Tracks were trampled by boots and side-by-side tires where half the valley had come to look. At the third, near a creek bend behind leased timber, he found muddy boot prints leading in before dawn and out with something heavy, likely meat cut from a dead animal after the fact. "Who else has this gate code?" he asked. Rancher spat into mud. "Too many." No broad midfoot impressions in the lots. No high bark pulls on nearby trees. No line of Dusk transit. Just familiar conflict wearing a new rumor because rumor travelled faster than necropsy. On the drive back, he stopped where private timber began and hiked a draw that connected, in theory, to his red line. There he found what he had hoped not to. Vertical cambium strips peeled from young cottonwood at 7, maybe 8 feet high. Long pulls with fibres hanging like wet paper. Nearby, in black mud under overhang, one partial track with that same centered load and splayed toe shape. Not near livestock, not near carcass. Passing through. He knelt, touched 2 fingers to the edge where print met water, and felt nothing mystical, only urgency tightening. At dusk now he talked more often, and not always to Lena. He'd settle on the ridge stump with his cap low and whisper practical things into the cold, as if briefing someone who might actually heed them. "Creek's loud tonight. You can come lower unseen." Or, "Road had fresh truck tracks by noon. Don't use the saddle." Once, catching himself halfway through a sentence, "Lena, you'd call this foolish and then tell me I'm right." He shut his mouth so hard his teeth clicked. Still, the habit returned. One evening, after a day of sleet and thaw, he heard movement behind him while there was still enough light to separate trunks from shadow. Not deer, too measured. 3 steps, pause, 2 steps. Then stillness at maybe 40 yards, just outside where his peripheral vision could lock detail. No branch crack, no rush. Presence held, patient as he was patient. Brett did not turn. "Wind's in my face," he said to the trees ahead. "I can't smell you." Silence. He set his binoculars down beside his boot. "I'm not setting bait, not calling anyone. Just watching crossings." A raven clacked once overhead and flew west. After a long minute, 2 soft footfalls retreated upslope. He let out breath he hadn't known he held and sat until dark erased the opposite ridge. By late October, he had 11 active cameras in a staggered ladder up the drainage, each one a compromise between data quality and not painting a path for anyone else. He downloaded cards nightly now rather than every third day in case weather or people removed units without warning. His kitchen turned into a map room, topo sheets weighted with bolts, index cards pinned by date, wolf movement tallies in blue, unknown transits in red, weather in pencil. On the night the moon came one day shy of full, he loaded Cam 11. Cam 11 overlooked a narrow shelf above the creek where glacial stones made a low rise in the brush. Most people would have passed it without seeing anything special. To Brett, it was the only place on that slope he could stand without feeling split in two. 3 years earlier, after the paperwork and casseroles and useless condolences, he had climbed there with Lena's ashes in a coffee can, sat until dark, and let grey powder go into wind and fern and rock. Later, he had stacked 5 flat stones into a small cairn because he needed his hands to do something exact. He did not point agency cameras at the cairn, ever. Cam 11 had been set 80 yards downslope for a wolf choke point. The shelf appeared only at frame edge in certain angles. At 1936, a juvenile wolf entered, tail low, ears forward. It circled once, twice, nose close to ground, then looked upslope and gave a brief whine too low the camera barely caught. At 1936, 24, the figure stepped into partial view between 2 fir trunks. Not blur this time. Still shadowed, still no clear face, but shape held long enough to read structure. High shoulders narrowing to hips, arms proportionally long, gait bipedal and balanced head carried level. It stopped beside the cairn and went motionless. The juvenile wolf moved closer, not tucked in fear, more like escort. It circled behind the figure then, lay down with forepaws out, head up, facing downhill as if on watch. Brett forgot to breathe. The timestamp crawled. 10 seconds. 20. 48. At 19:37:12, the figure bent at the waist, reached to the ground and lifted something pale. A willow switch, bark freshly stripped clean in one long ribbon. It placed the switch against the cairn, leaned it carefully so it would not fall, then straightened. The head turned once, not toward the trail, not toward creek, toward the exact axis where Cam 11 sat hidden behind mottled bark 30 yards away. Not looking through it, looking at it. Then it stepped back into trees and was gone. The wolf remained 3 more seconds, rose, and followed upslope without haste. Brett played the clip again, and again. Then once more, with sound boosted, hearing only creak hiss and a faint brush of movement. No vocalization, no display, no random wandering, place aware. He sat in the dark kitchen with the lamp off, laptop glow on his hands, and felt the whole frame of his work shift under him the way that creek log had shifted under current. This was not a feral giant blundering through habit loops, not a hoaxer in ghillie gear, not a trick of Dusk grain. Whatever moved that corridor had watched him watch it, learned his timing, found the one location loaded with his private grief, and marked it with an object chosen and set. Not threat, not submission either. Recognition at distance. By midnight, he had made decisions he did not write down. He opened each file properties panel and stripped non-essential metadata from copies he might ever transmit. He moved raw location-linked clips to an encrypted drive he kept in a lockbox under spare chainsaw parts. He built a clean export folder containing only wolf sequences with defensible ecological value, pack timing, route shifts, juvenile survival indicators, interaction spacing near human edges. For Cam 11, he clipped around the event and left only the juvenile wolf pass. In the report draft he started that night, He changed his emphasis from survey completion to corridor vulnerability. He mapped where wolves rerouted around private lease roads and where seasonal closure would reduce conflict spillover into calves. He used language officers respected, risk mitigation, movement integrity, depredation displacement, enforcement feasibility. No red marks, no anomalies, no mention of the willow leaning against 5 flat stones above a creek. At dawn, he hiked to the cairn. Mist sat low. Everything smelled of wet earth and alder. The willow switch stood exactly as in the clip, bark peeled smooth, one end cut, not snapped, at an angle he couldn't duplicate cleanly with his pocket knife. He crouched, touched the stripped wood with his thumb, and let his hand rest on cold stone. "I understand," he said, barely above breath. No answer came, but uphill, somewhere out of sight, a single branch gave under weight, and then held. He rose, left the switch where it was, and walked back down to check batteries before the day warmed. For the first time in 3 years, evening waited for him as more than an endurance test. It waited like a conversation with rules both sides had agreed to, without ever standing close enough to shake hands. That evening he moved through chores faster than he meant to, as if speed itself could keep balance. He split a short stack, banked the stove, checked battery voltages, and left the cabin before dusk, with Cam 12 in his pack and a coil of chain over one shoulder. He never reached the tree he'd picked. Halfway up the east bench, he found fluorescent survey ribbon tied to a lodgepole at eye level, 2 strips crossed like an X. 20 yards farther, another. Fresh boot cuts in frost-crusted mud. Deep heel, lug sole, one man carrying weight. He crouched and touched the edge of the print. Not yesterday. Predator control marking. He stood slowly and scanned the timber. More ribbon flashed between trunks where no logging line should be this season. The tags marched downslope toward the same narrow seam where his red line crossed private lease boundary. By full dark, his radio had 2 new messages. First was from a private number, male voice, cheerful in the way men got when they wanted to sound harmless while announcing force. "Mr. Graham, this is Cole Mercer with Bitterroot Wildlife Control. We've got a legal snare permit on West Fork leases for problem predators. Saw some of your units in overlap areas. Give me a call so we don't step on each other." Second was from Fish and Game Compliance. "Due to active depredation response, submit exact camera coordinates by 0900 tomorrow for safety deconfliction." Brett played both twice, then deleted neither. At the table, he opened the topo and stared at the red corridor line he'd drawn weeks ago. His own placements had mapped movement benches better than any contractor could have done in a month. If the state handed his full coordinates to a private snare crew, they would hang steel exactly where wolves and the tall traveller moved at dusk. Legal on paper, deadly on ground. He called Lewiston at 7:14. The coordinator answered tired. "I can provide wolf active zones," he said, keeping his voice flat. "Not exact mounts." "We need exact," she said. "Active trapping crews are claiming safety conflict." "Then move crews to confirmed depredation lots. South Valley carcasses are mostly cougar and scavenger disturbance." "Mostly isn't all." "Neither is rumor." Silence. Then a paper shuffle. "Brett, this is above me now. Regional wants cooperation on all assets. If you don't send coordinates, they can suspend your contract and recover equipment directly." He looked out the window where black timber held no edges. "You send private contractors into that drainage blind with snares, and you'll tangle wolves and dogs and maybe a hiker come late season. Then send the data so we can avoid exactly that." He almost laughed. "That's not what this is for." "What is it for, then?" He didn't answer. Couldn't. When the call ended, he sat with the radio in his hand until the battery warning chirped. The antagonist wasn't one face. It was pressure braided from fear, policy, liability, men making quick maps in warm rooms. If it succeeded, he'd lose more than a strange, careful truce at dusk. He'd lose the corridor he'd been trying to protect. Maybe the wolves' winter line. Maybe the only evidence that restraint could exist between species if people backed off. And if a cable found that long midfoot and cinched tight, there would be no committee meeting to undo it. By dawn, he made his move and watched it fail in slow pieces. He sent a formal packet, calf site notes, cougar cache indicators, boot scavenging photos, wolf transit tallies, and a clean corridor argument with proposed seasonal closure boundaries. Tight language, no speculation. Enough for any honest manager to justify delay on steel. At 11:02, the reply came from Regional, CC'd to legal and compliance. Request denied. Temporary predator control authorization remains in effect pending further review. All contractor operations deemed compliant within permit terms. Submit coordinate list by 1700 or prepare for equipment retrieval by enforcement. He read it once and set the phone face down. At noon, he drove to the lease gate and found it chained open. 2 pickups inside, one with snare cable spools stacked like grey snakes in the bed. Mercer himself stood by a tailgate writing numbers on weatherproof tags. "Graham," Mercer called, lifting 2 fingers. "You get my message?" Brett stopped 10 feet short. "You set where calves died?" "Where predators travel." "That line's full of wolves," Mercer shrugged. "Then wolves learn quick, or we release non-targets. We're not amateurs." Brett looked at the cable loops, at the swivels, at the short drags meant to tire and hold. Non-target release in wet freeze isn't release, it's triage. Mercer's smile thinned. "You got coordinates, we avoid your toys. You don't, we still work. Lease owners got signatures." Brett turned and left, before his temper chose words he couldn't unsay. He hiked to Cam 07 first. Empty tree, strap ends cut clean, lockbox gone. Cam 09 remained, but the housing had been opened and closed. One screw head was freshly scarred. Card still inside, but he could not know what had been copied. Cam 11, the one near Lena's shelf, was gone entirely, chain and all, bark shaved where someone had levered hardware free. He stood in that clearing with his hands hanging at his sides, feeling stripped in a way surprise couldn't touch. The unit loss was money, yes. The footage loss was worse. Whoever had those cards had timestamps, patterns, ridge approaches, maybe the clip at the cairn if they dug deep enough. He could not pull that back into secrecy, could not unring it. Rain began, fine and cold. He didn't move until he felt it through his collar. Back home, he checked the lockbox under chainsaw parts. Encrypted drive still there. Good. He opened it anyway, verified files, then made a second encrypted copy to a card he taped inside a broken thermos in the pantry. Redundancy had always been his religion, Today it felt like prayer after impact. At dusk, he went to his stump empty-handed for once. No binoculars, no notebook. Below him, a distant ATV whined where no machine should have been after dark. He listened until it cut out, then listened longer. He had tried process, data, the right words in the right forms. Process had answered with permits. Data had been repurposed as a roadmap for steel. The plan he'd built, quiet evidence, corridor protection through official channels, had not just stalled. It had armed the wrong people. For the first time since this began, he considered walking away. Pull every remaining unit, burn the red line map, let the drainage decide its own violence without him in it. Maybe that was cleaner than failing in installments. When he returned to the cabin, he stood at the sink with both palms flat on cold enamel and admitted the thought out loud. I can't do this right. The words shocked him by their plainness. No answer came from timber. No meaningful sign from weather. Only the stove settling and the small electric hum of the laptop he hadn't closed. He slept badly and woke before 3, heart running for no reason he could name. Unable to settle, he lit the kitchen lamp low and opened the green notebook to check old weather pages. Anything concrete. A folded sheet slid from the front cover and landed by his wrist. He recognized Lena's writing before he touched it. Quick, slanted, ink gone slightly brown with years. The fold lines were soft from being carried, not opened. On top she'd written, "For when you start pretending busy is the same as fine." He sat down hard and unfolded it. "Brett, if you're reading this, I finally got nosy enough to tuck paper where you can't ignore it forever. Sorry. Not sorry. You are very good at useful. You are terrible at scared. So I'm writing this while you're on assignment and I'm tired of rehearsing cheerful things into voicemail. Here is the part I don't say right. Every time the phone rings late, my body goes cold before my mind catches up. Every time you leave at 4 a.m. with that red bag, I count hours like a superstitious fool. I know your training. I know your judgment. I also know lightning doesn't care. I act steady because somebody should. I make lists because lists are what I can control when I can't control fire or wind or other people's bad calls. That doesn't mean I'm not afraid. It means I'm afraid all the time and choose useful anyway. Sound familiar? Sometimes I get mad at you for being brave where I can't follow. Sometimes I get mad at myself for wanting you home when people need you out there. Both can be true. If anything ever happens to you, to me, to us, please don't turn into a ghost that chops wood and answers nobody. Don't make routine into a bunker. Let somebody in, even if it's just the trees and weather and that old raven you argue with. You don't have to perform fine for the dead. I married you because you notice what matters. Keep noticing, even when it hurts. Especially then. Love, always, Lena. The letter shook once in his hand, then again harder. He put it down, pressed thumb and forefinger to his eyes, and sat there while grief came not like a clean wave, but like Thor. Slow, unstoppable, every locked thing turning to movement. When he could breathe evenly, he read it a second time. Then he folded it along the old lines and set it beside the map, not back inside the cover. She had written fear without hiding, and he had spent 3 years mistaking silence for strength. Her vulnerability sat on the table between batteries and steel tape, as practical and as exposed as any field note. It did not solve a single external problem. It did, however, remove one lie, that he could do this by numbing out harder. At first light, he copied her line, "Choose useful anyway," onto a fresh notebook page above his daily entries. Snow started in wet strings by mid-afternoon, sticking only in shade. By evening it thickened, heavy and windless, the kind that loaded bows and muffled everything but creek water. Early November weather had arrived like a door closing. He took no truck. Roads would carry sound too far. He moved on foot along the upper bench where he'd seen survey ribbon, head down against meltwater dripping from fir tips. In the half-light he found the first snare set at a pinch point. Cable loop, chest high for a wolf, anchored to a live sapling with swivel and support wire. Scent lure dabbed on bark. Legal on lease, lethal anywhere. He marked it on his own map and kept going. Second set near a game trail saddle. Third, lower, where deer and wolves braided tracks in mud. The placements were efficient and ugly, designed by someone who understood movement funnels and did not care what else travelled them. As dusk thickened, he heard wolves to the north. Short barks, not hunting chorus. Agitated spacing calls. Then silence, then one drawn-out whine that raised hair along his arms. He altered course upslope, moving faster than his knees liked. Wet snow grabbed at brush and deadfall. Twice he slipped and caught himself on saplings. Once he stopped to listen and heard it, a faint metallic tick, pause, tick, as if cable swivel tapped wood under strain. He followed the sound into a narrow clearing where trail, slope, and timber forced anything large to commit. At first he saw only wolves, two shapes at the edge of brush, pacing tight arcs, ears pinned, not charging him but not yielding either. Their breath smoked white. One gave a low warning rumble and backed 3 steps, eyes cutting past him toward a fir trunk. Then Brett saw the cable. It ran taut from anchor chain to a loop cinched around a lower leg of the tall figure braced against the tree, shoulders heaving in controlled breaths. No thrashing, no wild panic, just contained force and pain held on a narrow margin. Snow clung to dark hair along the forearms. One hand gripped bark hard enough to strip it. The other hung open, shaking once, then still. The figure turned its head toward him. Not full face, still shadow and storm, but unmistakably aware. Behind Brett, far down in the drainage, an engine started on the lease road and climbed gears towards the ridge. He checked his watch by headlamp cup without turning it fully on. Less than an hour to first grey. Less to truck lights if the crew kept coming. He set his pack down in the snow and reached slowly for the bolt cutters. He set his pack down in the snow and reached slowly for the bolt cutters. "Easy," he said, voice pitched low and even, the way he used to brief rookies hanging under canopy with a crown fire rolling below. "I'm coming in. I'm cutting you out. Don't pull when I'm on the cable." The figure did not bare teeth, did not lunge. It shifted weight once, a hard tremor running through shoulders and arms, then went still again with one hand flattened on fir bark. Snow melted where its breath struck the trunk. The wolves at the brush edge paced tighter. One gave a warning bark that ended in a whine. Brett knelt just outside reach of the trapped leg and saw the snare clear. 3 30-seconds aircraft cable. Lock jammed high above what would have been an ankle on a man, but lower on this frame, blood black in low light. No relaxing mechanism worth a damn. Anchor chain wrapped to a live sapling with 2 quick links. Lure paste on a twig nearby, sharp and rancid under wet snow scent. "Bad set," he muttered, more to his own hands than anything. Bad set. He slid the cutter jaws onto the cable between lock and anchor, braced elbows against his knees, and squeezed. Nothing. Old shoulder lit up with pain like a hot nail. He reset, got better bite, and pushed with both hands until his forearms shook. The steel gave 0.5 millimeter, then held. Down in the drainage, engine noise climbed again. Closer now, grinding in low gear on the lease road. Headlights flickered through trunks 2 ridges below. He exhaled once, set his left boot against the anchor chain, and drove the cutters closed with his whole body. The cable snapped with a flat metallic pop. The released length whipped and stung his glove. The figure jerked, caught itself against the fur, and made a sound Brett felt more than heard. Air forced through clenched pain. There, back," Brett said, raising both hands open as he scooted away on his heels. "You're free. Get off this line." The trapped leg came up, tentative, then down again. Limp, obvious. One wolf stepped forward, nose twitching at blood, then turned and looked upslope as if calling a route. Headlights flashed brighter through snow. Brett grabbed the cut cable, the lock, the chain, every piece he could reach. He yanked support wire from the guide stick, wiped the lure twig into snow, then kicked that snow over the stain. Fast, not perfect. He used a spruce bough to brush his knee prints and the deep gouge where the cable had dug when it first tightened. When he looked up, the figure was still there, chest heaving, head tilted toward him. "Go," he said, and pointed uphill. "Now." For a suspended beat, nothing moved. Then the figure turned, put weight on the injured leg with visible effort, and stepped into the timber. The wolves fell in, one ahead, one behind, ghosting through fir trunks with no wasted motion. In 3 breaths, they were gone. Brett swung the coil of cable into his pack, zipped it halfway, and straightened just as a beam of white light cut through the clearing. "Hey!" a voice shouted. "Who's up there?" Cole Mercer emerged through brush in a yellow shell, flashlight in one hand, sidearm at his hip, another man behind him with a leash and an eager hound straining forward. Mercer stopped when he recognized Brett. His expression hardened. "What the hell are you doing on an active line?" Brett kept his hands where Mercer could see them. "Walking wolf corridor. Found your set." Mercer's beam dropped to the disturbed snow, then snapped up to Brett's pack. "You touch my equipment?" "I removed a dangerous snare." "Dangerous?" Mercer barked a short laugh. "It's legal steel on leased ground." Brett pointed with 2 fingers toward a rock outcrop barely visible through snowfall. "Lease line's down there. You're on state parcel by at least 100 yards, and this cable has no breakaway worth code. You catch a non-target, it stays caught." Mercer took a step closer. "Don't lecture me on code, old man. You trespass my line and cut hardware. That's tampering." Brett met his eyes. "Then call it in. We can all walk this line at daylight, with GPS." The hound lunged toward the fur where blood scent lingered. Mercer's partner reeled it back. Mercer didn't look away from Brett. "You been feeding wolves numbers to keep this place shut down?" he asked. "That your game?" "My game is keeping bad operators from hanging cable where they can't control what they catch." Mercer smiled without warmth. "You think anybody's going to take your word over a permitted crew?" Brett shrugged once. "Word won't matter. Coordinates will." For a moment, Mercer looked like he might swing the flashlight, or the fist holding it. Then he turned sharp to his partner. "Pull the lower sets, now. Dog's got hot scent, and I'm not wasting it on this circus." Brett walked past him without brushing shoulders. He could feel Mercer's glare between his shoulder blades all the way down the slope. At the ridge where 1 bar of signal sometimes held, he stopped beneath a snag and cupped the radio mic in both hands to block wind. "Clearwater Dispatch," he said when the channel cracked alive, voice flattened to anonymity. "I need to report trap violations on West Fork leases spilling onto state ground. Untagged or improperly tagged snares, probable non-target capture on active wolf corridor. Coordinates follow." He gave 3 points. Not the clearing he'd just left. 3 others he'd logged earlier that day with obvious compliance problems and photographed. "Can you identify yourself?" Dispatch asked. "No," he said. "But if you wait till noon, snow will bury sign." He clicked off and stood in dark long enough for his pulse to settle. By first grey, he was back at the cabin, boots soaked, beard crusted with ice. He set the snare hardware on the table under the kitchen lamp. Cut cable, lock, chain, swivel, a permit tag with numbers partly filed off. He photographed each piece beside a ruler, then dropped them into a 5-gallon pail and shoved it under split kindling. He did not sleep. Enforcement arrived on the lease before lunch. State compliance, 1 county deputy, and by mid-afternoon a federal wildlife officer because wolves were documented in the drainage and nobody wanted a jurisdiction fight later. Snow made every boot track legible. The 3 coordinates Brett had called in produced exactly what he knew they would. 2 misset snares over legal loop diameter, 1 anchored wrong, all too close to a public trail spur, 1 with no visible tag at all. Mercer fought from the tailgate of his truck, voice carrying half a mile. "Political hit," he shouted, jabbing a finger at the map board. "Some anonymous crank doesn't like predator control, so now we're criminals." The federal officer, a woman with a flat Montana accent and no patience, held up 1 cable and said, Criminal depends on what this hair sample comes back as. Until then, your line is suspended. Mercer swung on Brett when he spotted him at the edge of the crowd. You did this. Brett didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either. You set bad steel in bad country. Mercer advanced 2 steps before the deputy moved between them. You think you're protecting something, Mercer spat. You just made ranch losses worse. Blood's on you when calves die. Brett's jaw tightened. Calves don't die from shadows you invent. They die from specific predators and sloppy husbandry, and men who'd rather blame whatever sells a story. Story? Mercer laughed harshly. You don't even know what's up there. Brett held his gaze. No, but I know what not to do about it. Suspension didn't end the fight. It shifted it. By evening, Mercer had called the regional office and filed a formal complaint accusing Brett of interference, data withholding, and equipment tampering. Compliance forwarded a notice. Turn in all camera coordinates immediately for review. Appear by phone at 0900 with contract supervisor and legal. At 8:42 p.m., headlights swept Brett's cabin wall. Mercer's truck idled in the yard, though no one had invited him in. Brett stepped onto the porch with a lantern and a digital recorder in his pocket already running. Mercer got out slow, face flushed from cold and anger. You think hiding behind anonymous calls keeps me blind? I got cards from cameras your office pulled. I know where you've been. Brett stayed on the top step. Then you know where wolves move and where to stay out. Mercer laughed. You're in over your head. You've got something on those cards, don't you? Something you don't want seen. Brett said nothing. Mercer took another step, boots grinding frost. Give me the raw files, old man. I make one call. Your contract dies tomorrow. Brett lifted the lantern a little higher, letting light hit Mercer's face full on. You make one more uninvited stop at my cabin, and I file harassment with county and state together, with audio. Mercer's eyes flicked to the recorder bulge in Brett's flannel pocket and narrowed. For the first time that day, uncertainty crossed his face. You don't scare me, he said. Good, Brett replied. Fear makes men careless. You're already proving that. Mercer stood another 3 seconds, then turned sharply, got in his truck, and fishtailed out, throwing gravel against Brett's porch posts. At 0900, Brett sat at his kitchen table with the speakerphone between coffee mug and notebook while rain tapped the roof. Regional Legal opened hard. Mr. Graham, failure to provide coordinate data upon request constitutes non-compliance. Brett answered in the same steady cadence he used on radios, in smoke. Coordinate data supplied at management scale. Exact mount points withheld due active private contractor conflict and ongoing law enforcement review. Dana, the field coordinator from Lewiston, came on next, voice tight but controlled. Brett, we're trying to protect everyone out there. Help us help you. He looked at Lena's letter by his elbow, then at the wolf movement map he'd redrafted overnight. You want help? He said. Take this drainage out of contractor circulation from November through den dispersal. You put steel here during dusk movement and you buy bycatch and headlines. Legal cut in. On what evidentiary basis? On 9 years prior wolf transit, on this season's pack counts, on depredation site mismatch with corridor use. On your own enforcement findings yesterday. I can send full report in 30 minutes. Silence. Paper rustled. Keyboard clicks. Dana said quietly, Send it. He did. All of it that mattered. Routes, timings, conflict overlap. Closure boundary proposal with enforcement access points and seasonal dates. No anomalous clips. No cairn footage. No coordinates that would lead anyone to the shelf above the creek. By late afternoon, Regional issued an interim order. Temporary no-snare zone across the upper drainage pending review. Mercer's permit remained suspended. He appealed loudly to anyone who'd listen. The appeal hearing was set for 1 week out. At the hearing, video call patched through a county office with bad fluorescent lights. Mercer argued economics, depredation panic, and career bureaucrats caving to myth. Brett argued maps and carcass diagnostics and movement integrity. Dana backed the numbers. The federal officer backed compliance findings. A rancher Brett had visited in the valley, hat in his hands and eyes down, admitted half his losses dropped after he night-penned and strung Fladry on calving lots. It took 2 hours and 3 recesses. In the end, the board voted 4-1 for a seasonal closure in Brett's proposed boundaries. Mercer left the room before adjournment, chair scraping hard enough to echo. Defeat did not make him graceful. It made him smaller. That night, the storm finally broke. Cold came in clean and sharp, stars hard above black ridgelines. Brett hiked to the clearing where the cable had bitten and found wind-scoured snow, faint wolf tracks, and one deeper print from a larger biped placing weight carefully on the outside edge of an injured foot. No blood now. He stood with hands in pockets and let the silence settle around him. Crisis had its own chemical clarity. Do this, then this. No room for regret. Afterward came tremor and second-guessing. His hands shook a little as he lit the small stove at home. His shoulder throbbed where he'd forced the cutters. He sat at the table with the encrypted drive in front of him and hovered over folders for a long time. Then he deleted the clips that could lead men to that clearing by date, angle, and terrain markers. Not all footage, not all proof. The damning location-linked sequences, the cairn clip in raw form, the files curiosity would weaponize. He kept behavior notes in his green notebook instead, stripped of coordinates, written like field observations from a species without a name. It hurt in a way he hadn't expected, to erase evidence after fighting so hard to gather it. But fame had never been neutral in country like this. Attention killed just as surely as winter sometimes, only louder. Near midnight he stepped outside with the pail of snare hardware and carried it to the shed. He set it high on a shelf behind old chains and paint cans, out of sight, not out of memory. On his way back he stopped at the edge of the yard. In new moon dark the trees were a single wall. He listened. A branch flexed once upslope, then released. Not close, not far either. He raised one hand, palm out, the same sign he'd used in the clearing before cutting steel. "Still here," he said. No reply came, but he slept through until dawn for the first time in weeks. 2 days later, he climbed to the stone cairn with Lena's letter folded in his pocket and a thermos of coffee gone lukewarm. Frost rimed the fern stems. The willow switch still leaned against the stones, weathered now to a dull cream. He sat on a flat rock, opened the letter, and read the first line aloud. "Brett, if you're reading this, I finally got nosy enough to tuck paper where you can't ignore it forever." His voice cracked on the word, forever. He cleared it and kept going, reading each paragraph into cold air while creak noise rose below like static. When he finished, he folded the page on his knee and looked at the cairn. "You were afraid," he said, as if Lena were sitting cross-legged where she used to sit to retie bootlaces. "I knew that and acted like I didn't. Thought if I held still enough, maybe fear would pass by and spare us." He laughed once, soft and tired. "Good plan." Wind moved through the fir crowns. He waited, then spoke again. "I did exactly what you told me not to. Chopped wood, wrote weather, answered nobody, called it discipline when it was hiding." He rubbed thumb over the letter's fold crease. "Then something out there started moving at dusk, and I had to choose between being right and being useful. You already knew which one mattered." He read another line aloud, almost a whisper. Don't make routine into a bunker. I hear you, he said. Late, but I hear you. He sat with that for a long time, not seeking a sign, just staying. At last he poured a little coffee onto the earth beside the stones, an old camp habit Lena used to tease him for, and said, I can't promise cheerful voicemail. I can promise this. I won't disappear while I'm still breathing. A soft crunch sounded uphill. He did not turn quickly. He turned as if checking weather. 30 yards above, half screened by young fir, a tall, dark shape stood between trunks, motionless, watching. The injured leg still favored, but steadier now. Brett looked once, then lowered his eyes to the cairn so it would not read as challenge. You too, he said, not loud. No bunkers. The shape remained another breath, then another, and slipped back into timber without sound. He touched the top stone of the cairn and smiled for the first time in months without forcing it. Yeah, he said to nobody and not nobody. That'll do. Spring came in stages, not sentiment. First, the snow line climbed above the lower benches. Then creek water turned brown and loud with melt. Then grass showed in the south-facing swales where deer fed at dusk. At the county hall in April, ranchers crowded folding tables for a workshop on non-lethal calf protection, mostly because insurance reps had started asking what mitigation they used before paying claims. Brett sat in the back in his old wool coat while a younger biologist demonstrated fladry lines and night penning layouts with PVC pipe models. A rancher from the South Valley, the same one who'd shown him carcasses, caught Brett by the coffee urn. Did what you said, the man admitted, not quite meeting his eyes. Penned nights, lights on motion sensors, flagging on north fence. Lost one this month instead of 5. Brett nodded. That's one calf too many, but better direction. The man hesitated. Mercer says closures are politics. Mercer says lots of things. Yeah, the rancher snorted. State yanked half his permits after that inspection. Heard he's working fence lines in Montana now. Good country for fences, Brett said, and left it there. In May, Dana drove up the washboard road to his cabin with 2 interns in the back seat and a box of new camera straps. Closure held through review, she said, handing him signed paperwork. Board made it seasonal through den dispersal. Your corridor language stayed almost untouched. Brett flipped pages, checked boundary coordinates, and gave one short nod. Dana watched him a moment. You ever gonna tell me what lit this fire under you? He looked past her shoulder toward the timber, where evening shadow had started to gather, though it was still an hour to sundown. Wolves needed room, he said. She smiled like she knew that wasn't the full sentence, and accepted it anyway. The interns spent half the afternoon loading batteries and asking too many questions in good faith. One of them, a kid named Miguel with brand new gaiters and blister tape on both heels, looked up from the map at dusk and asked, Mr. Graham, why do you sit still up there every evening? We've got motion sensors now. Brett cinched a pack strap, then pointed with his chin toward the ridge stump. Sensors catch movement, he said. Watching catches meaning. Miguel frowned, thinking. Brett added, out here the ones that last learn when to be seen and when to step back into trees. That evening, after they drove off in a cloud of dust, Brett split Tamarack before first light's memory had fully left the sky, carried creek water, logged wind in the green notebook, and climbed to his stump with binoculars resting on his knees. Below, Tournier's pack moved the lower bench in loose file, pups, nearly yearlings now. Farther upslope, just at the edge where dusk turned trunks to bars of black, something taller crossed once, paused and continued into shadow without hurry. Brett did not raise the binoculars. He didn't need to. He sat until dark took detail away, then rose and walked home by memory, not emptied, not finished grieving, but accompanied at a distance by lives that had chosen the same hard country and the same rule. Keep faith, keep watch, and leave room.